Welcome to the Music Ed Matters podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Emily Williams Birch, and this podcast, it exists for you. Whether you're a music lover, an educator, a choir member, each week we bring guests to the show to help explore what matters in music. I'm so glad that you're here. Welcome to the show. Hello, and welcome to the Music Ed Matters podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Emily Williams Birch, and today, in this advocacy and collaboration curated episode, you are talking to composer Dale Trumbore. In this episode, we talk about how Dale found music and how her career as a composer has grown and developed. We talk specifically about collaborating and working with poets and other types of writing. There's some great resources dropped too. We then talk about Dale's compositional process and lots of tips for how we can interpret the music in front of us. I really loved how this conversation was just like two friends sitting over a cup of coffee. So I'm not going to talk anymore. We know this episode is brought to you by our friends over at Perform International. Check them out for all of your ideas for traveling. And if you want more, check it out at the patreon.com/The Music Ed Matters podcast. All right, without further ado, I can't wait for you to hear from Dale Trumbore. Today on the Music Ed Matters podcast, we are talking to composer and awesome human being, Dale Trumbore. Hello, Dale.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
I'm so excited this is finally happening. We connected at ACDA earlier this spring, and for our schedules to finally line up, I'm thrilled to be speaking with you. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm really happy to be here and excited to see where this conversation goes.
All right, I'm dying to know more about your story because I know your music, I hear your music, I've seen your music, and I've met you. But I want to know, how did you get into this field? What is your story?
Yeah, so I've been singing, I was singing in choirs from when I was like 7 through maybe age 25. So it started young. Like I sang in school. I was in church choirs when I was young, and just like was always singing. Started piano around the same age and started composing around the same age. So I've just had music in my life since I was really little. My mom would play musical theater like just on CDs and also at the piano. And my dad walks around the house singing all the time. Like there's just music. Like they're not musicians. My parents are not professional musicians, but there was always music in my house growing up. So that's, I think, really where all of that started, just being immersed in it.
So did you sing in community choirs? Because you're from New Jersey. Where did you sing?
I mostly sang. So in New Jersey, I mostly just sang with my my high school. Like I was in the varsity, quote unquote varsity, like treble choir there, and there was the traditional like, is the mixed, good choir better than the mixed treble choir? And the choir, like our teacher was always like, no, you're just as good as the SATB choir, even though it's like the rejects who didn't get into the SATB choir were the overflow choir. Clearly I'm still bitter about that a little bit, but it was actually really great. Like that experience, I got to arrange for that ensemble as a junior in high school. And that was really rewarding. And yeah, but so I sang in, I was raised Episcopalian. I'm agnostic now, but I sang in church choir from like age 7 to, 18, 20, like whenever I left for college, and then being dragged back a little bit by my family.
Yeah. Okay. Do you remember that first piece you arranged for your treble varsity choir?
Yeah, it was And All That Jazz from Chicago, because I was really into that. And for some reason, my choir director was too, I guess, like at the time. So that worked out. Yeah, it was really fun and really hard. Like it's a really hard arrangement. I think I used to think as a composer that you had to do everything in a single piece. So like the sopranos, like you have to use the highest part of their range, and the alto twos, like in a treble arrangement, you have to use the lowest possible notes in their range. And that is completely false. Like that just limits which ensembles and which kind of ensembles can do that piece in the future. So now I'm not like, there has to be, a high A or high optional B and like a low G or F in every treble piece. That's absurd. But little high school me was like, let's do all the things at once.
What a great life lesson, though, because I mean, having I just finished teaching fundamentals of songwriting, and we talked a lot about how the voice is a different instrument than all the other instruments that they are used to composing with. A lot of them have film score backgrounds or digital audio workstation backgrounds where they don't work with a lot of live instruments. And we talked about ranges and tessituras and the when to put an accent on which beat for how to place the text in the right place. So did you learn that through experience, or did you take the ideas of high school and then pursue that beyond?
Yeah, I think it was a mix of just singing in choir constantly. And also I talk a lot about how I have an aunt who was, I like to brag that she was the poet laureate of Louisiana from 2013 to 2014, Julie Kane. Julie Kane is her name. And I just worked with her on a new piece for chorus, piano, and harp. Because she's really into our Irish ancestry and researching that, and that was really fun as a project. But I say all of that to then say that I grew up with poetry, like having a poet in the family and having her books on the bookshelf and reading them and loving poetry as well. And I think so Julie in particular is a new formalist. Like she's really into using traditional forms like sonnets and villanelles, which have a really strict meter and rhyme scheme. And so I think that you could make an argument that that also informed like young composer Dale growing up, that even when I was like, 11, 12, 13, those really formative years of like who you are and like who you'll become. I was into music, and then I was also just reading a lot of poems and internalizing that meter in written form as well as musical form.
What a cool collaboration just in and of itself. I mean, this is an advocacy and collaboration episode, and I think it is so interesting when you have that mindset on, you see the collaborations. And for you, it was the collaboration of poetry to music and how that sat. Have you branched out into other types of poetry since then? What are you finding? I know we're going to talk about your book in a second, but what are you finding is your favorite type of text to set?
Yeah, I love writing with contemporary writers, and very often contemporary writers, because they have the freedom, just as composers have the freedom to write in absolutely any style or genre that we want. Uh, a lot of contemporary poetry is free verse, but some of it is very metrical or informed by rhyme or internal rhyme. Um, it might not be as strict as something like a sonnet, but there's still a sense of like an internal beat within the poem. Like I know Annie Finch is a poet that I've worked with before, and she's really big on like repetition and how does that inform words. And yeah, so I keep coming back to these contemporary poets. Some of them, I have maybe 10 or 12 poets that I've worked with a bunch of times. And Barbara Crooker, who wrote the text for In the Middle, which is a piece of mine that gets performed a fair bit. I've worked with her now. I think, well, I'm writing a concert length piece of hers with like, the libretto is drawn from, I think, 26 of her poems, maybe. And so it's like, I've worked with her now. It will be like 30, or no, I don't, like maybe like 40 times or something. I think like I'll have set like 40 of her poems in various ways. So I love collaborating.
That is such a great way to like connecting into those texts. In the advocacy and collaboration blog post that we borrowed from you for this month, you talked about how to collaborate with a composer. So are there tips for collaborating with a composer and a poet? And are some of those the same, or are they different? What are some of those insights you can give?
Yeah, I think there's some overlap there. And for sure in every collaboration, you just want communication, as much communication as possible. We were just talking before that we started recording about Chorus America, and I just was on a panel there talking about commissioning. And there were a few sort of audience questions about like what happens if you get a piece and you don't like the piece, or the composer is completely ignored, like the timeline you set out in any way. And the answer is like there are solutions to those questions, but if you ask every possible question, like there are no stupid questions at the start of a collaboration. Like what are you expecting from me? Why me? Like why like when I'm reaching out to a poet, I can say, I really love, like, I just really responded to this poem. I'm looking to write a piece about, sometimes I get a theme like the ocean or America, or, it could be really, it could be anything. But like, I'm looking for poems on this text, and here's the form that I anticipate this take it. Like, it's going to be an art song, or it's going to be for choir. It's going to premiere this day. The more information you can give up front, the better.
That's so important. And it shows that you've done your research and that you have the vision of where it's going versus just nebulous. Let's see what happens.
Exactly.
All right. So you talked a little bit about when you communicate with these poets, but you also say that you often write about working through your creative challenges. What do you mean by creative challenges before we dive into your book? Because I'm super excited to talk about that too.
I very often will, I think for me, it's anxiety and self-doubt. And that's the subtitle of the book of Staying Composed. It's like overcoming anxiety and self-doubt within a creative life. I think for me, like, it's not so much about writer's block. I do think some people experience that, right? But I have all these strategies. Like, I'll save work, like really boring editing. I'll save that to do on the days when I'm not feeling as inspired to be creative, like in a generative way, so that I can still make progress on a piece. But it doesn't matter if I feel inspired or not. Like, you don't have to be inspired to be moving dynamics around, or like typing in lyrics, or formatting a title page. So I'm very purposeful about like what work I do when, so that when I am in a generative mood, I can just run with it. Like, I clear out space in my schedule every day. I try and keep roughly like 2 to 4 p.m. free, because that's when I like actually creating new music. But in terms of those blocks, I am like, I have anxiety, like generalized anxiety, social anxiety. And it's just a matter of knowing how that presents itself and being ready for those blocks. Like, if it's something that's regular, that happens often, then you can learn to recognize it and know that it's coming, and then be prepared for it, to meet it where it is, and not add additional anxiety to the fact that something isn't feeling right.
And that kind of ties back to your whole, the more communication, the better. You're just communicating with yourself in that way. I think we all have that self-doubt piece. I mean, that imposter syndrome is real, especially in our musical world. But it's so interesting how you talk about writing, like you write about it and you get it out there, and then you wrote this book on it. It's okay, we have to talk about the book now because I'm so excited. Can you tell us a little bit about Staying Composed, which is your first book? And I love this quote: a treasure trove of practical strategies for moving your artistic career forward. It's amazing.
Yeah, so it's really, the thesis is what I was just talking about, in that sense of like learning your process, but not just like, oh, I'm most productive between 2 and 4 p.m., but like every part of your process. How do you prefer to interact with other people? There's chapters on things like jealousy, like what to do if you're feeling jealous of a colleague, for example. Like, can you I say in the book, can you turn that jealousy into a very specific prescription for an action you can take, based on what you're feeling? Or like, can you use a metaphor or an analogy of like, you're both on different paths, and it truly has no impact on your own career how fast or slow other people are moving. So there's the idea for the book, like the structure behind it, is moving from obstacles you face very early on in your career, to ones you face like the more and more success you find. And again, just how do you meet with those obstacles with preparation and with grace? That's really the driving force behind me wanting to write this book, was like finding those challenges in my own life and wanting to give the solutions that I've found, wanting to give that helpful advice, to not necessarily in a prescriptive way, like, I do this, so you have to do this. This is not that. That's not what the book is about. But like, I have found this helpful as a strategy. You might try this strategy. If it works for you, great. That's awesome.
So do you find that writing the book and composing music, what are those similarities and differences?
It's interesting. There's a lot of talk in writing communities about I think like there are all sorts of different weird words to describe basically like, do you sprint or do you marathon? Like, do you work a little bit every day or do you not write for a while and then write a whole lot like on a weekend or like over a week or something when you do have free time? And I'm completely opposite in writing and composing, which is very
Really?
strange because there's so many similarities. Like I like to say the strategies in staying composed, you can apply them to almost any artistic career, right? Like any artistic endeavor. But writing, I very much like go in spurts. Like I'll sit down and I'll be really, really productive for like a day. And then like a month will go by and I won't write anything, depending on the project and deadlines and all that. Whereas composing, I have this like very steady, a little bit every day and I put aside the boring work and I come back to it. And yeah, it's completely opposite. So lots of similarities, but that is not one of them.
Now that you're tossing those words out there, I'm thinking about it. Like me practicing piano is a little bit every day. I touch it every day because I feel like if I don't, I lose my chops. But writing the book I just wrote, I am such a sprinter. I would like sit down and like and be done. That was all I had that day. It was hilarious. I loved writing a book though. That process was absolutely incredible and horrible and amazing at the same time.
Yeah. I'm curious, like, how did you find writing the book versus writing essays, like, or writing smaller, like little
Yeah.
things?
I would never write a dissertation ever again, but I would totally write a book again. That was the biggest aha. And it was a different type of creativity. But I also feel like whatever you're putting yourself into, whatever creative bucket you're putting yourself into, at school, I am surrounded by some of the most creative students I've ever seen in my life that are at SCAD for just creative careers. The tagline of the university is the University for Creative Careers. And it's not unlikely for a student to say, yeah, I compose on these different digital stations and I play 7 instruments. And oh, yeah, I'm a poet minor and I do illustration on the side. Like they just have these creative minds. And I feel when you're in the place with other creatives, I'm finding myself more creative. I'm writing little songs in class. I'm like, y'all, look, I wrote a song. It's so much fun. But it's really interesting to see. And I think the process of writing puts you in the world of people that are using words to communicate. And that collaboration of itself is just beautiful in helping us as musicians to continue conversations, if that makes any sense at all.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. I love that. I think there's something there too about like a score. When I create a score, it then has to be realized by performers or a performer, right? And sometimes you need to get a conductor involved and there's all these people making other choices, whereas a book, it's a collaboration also in the sense that the reader is like it's the music of the words is happening in their mind completely and there's no one else between you, like the document you've created and the person experiencing it and them having their own experience. Like I think there's something really direct and straightforward about that and really beautiful about that as well.
Yeah, you're right. And that interpretation element of it, like one is a direct line and the other is almost like an experience in a way, which is again another type of collaboration and something else we have to continue to advocate for, which is exciting. I love that you use the word collaboration on your website and it's easy to find. Have you always been a collaborator or is that something that's come as you've become more confident and written this book? How do you view your approach to the world as you've grown as a composer?
Well, I think for like collaborating for me, it really just comes back to who who do I really respect as a person? I say this a lot, but who do I respect and admire as a human being and as a musician? Or if it's for writing, then it's a human being and a writer too. Like right now, I'm working on a book. We're in sort of the early stages, the interview stages, but a book about music creators and the money business side of things. I'm co-writing with Brandon Elliott, who is a conductor and also a fabulous writer and has been a longtime friend. But I know because I've worked with him in a musical collaborative way, I know that we're good collaborators and that will apply to anything we do. So I find myself a lot of the time, like while I am constantly seeking out new people to collaborate with, if I know that I've collaborated well with someone in the past, like I have a soprano singer friend who is one of my just one of my favorite people, and I've recorded 2 albums of art songs with her because I just love her as a person and as a performer, and that makes it so easy to work with her.
Those relationships, it's not just let me cherry pick these things. Let's build the relationship and then continue to build upon that relationship, which is beautiful. I want to totally switch gears. Someone listening that is programming your music or looking at your music, can you talk us through your compositional process and some tips for someone approaching your music so that they can realize it in the most authentic way possible?
Yeah, I think I'm sort of 2 minds on this. Like on one hand, I I want my vision for the piece to come through. Uh, so I do love if a conductor is doing a piece, and even if the piece has been recorded, like even if there's like 3 live recordings on YouTube, um, I still love when someone just sends me an email through my website, or like asks me in person at a conference or something like, oh, like we're doing this, like what were you thinking about this part, or like we were going to do it this way, but like should we do it this way? I still like being asked that question, even though sometimes then my answer, the flip side of this is, I love having multiple different interpretations of a piece of music. And I think that's part of the beauty of, I guess, like of just having um, new music, of performers and conductors programming new music in general, is that yes, the composer is there. If they're alive, you can reach out to them, you can ask questions, but also my intention as a composer is to create, again, a document that will hopefully outlive me, right? That will like have all the information contained in a score, everything you need to then realize that piece successfully. And within that, there's room. Like I try to not put exact tempo markings. Like even if it is exact, it'll say circa. Like it always. I want that flexibility. I want that room for every conductor and then every singer to bring a little bit of their own choices to that piece. And something I think about a lot too is how to build that into a score, like whether it's creating something aleatoric or even something as simple as a fermata. That's a conductor choice. That's not a me choice, right? That's not a composer choice. That's a performer choice. And I love how all those little moments come together to make a piece uniquely that performers or that ensembles.
I'm glad you say that, because as a lot of times when I'm working with like coaching some of the vocal students, I'll say, what recordings have you listened to? What oral image do you have? And it's okay to combine different examples or to hear them and say, no, I think I'd rather it be that way. And that's such a freeing feeling. As long as
absolutely.
all the information is there. But you're right, the information has to be there so your score can outlive you, which is great. So when you get a piece of music that you're writing, either something that you've been inspired by or something that has been a collaboration, a commission, what's step one? What do you do first?
Yeah, so if I get a commission, I find a text, and that for me looks like going to sometimes I'll go to books, I'll go to the internet, but I also keep a database of poems by people I've collaborated with in the past, right? This circles back to loving working with certain people and then trying to work with them again and again. So I have maybe like 40 poems sort of stashed away. Like I would love to set these. I don't know when, but I'm just waiting to see if the right opportunity comes up. And then let's say we have an initial, commissioning discussion. We decide on the length of the piece, the deadline, the rate I'll be paid, all of that. Then I can go to that poem database and I pick, usually it's 2 to 3 poems that I think will be a great fit for what we talked about, like for the eventual length of the piece, any themes. or like sometimes a concert celebrating something, right? Like it's a gala or something, and that sort of informs the text choice as well. And then if the conductor hates all of those poems, which happens sometimes, not hates, but is just like, well, I feel like we could do better, then I'll either go back to that database or I'll do that, and I'll also seek out other. I like to use, I think it's called Project Gutenberg for public domain texts, because you can find entire books there. So sometimes if you're just searching for like Emily Dickinson poems or something, right? She's a really common go-to for choral composers. So is Sarah Teasdale, Walt Whitman. You can find a whole book of that author, or a book by a contemporary of that poet who is not set to death, like Sarah Teasdale. And you can find lesser set poems, or sometimes you can find writings by like prose writings by an author that are public domain and that happen to be really great potential choral texts, even though they're not a poem, right? A text doesn't have to be a poem. It could be a found piece of writing. It could be I've set like a tweet and a Facebook post, and I'm no longer on Twitter or Facebook, but every once in a while I'm like, I should set an Instagram post just to complete the trilogy.
Yes.
Of like the triptych of.
I don't think there's text on Snapchat or Be Real, but if there is, I'll let you know. I'm not smart enough in that world yet.
Oh my God. Yeah. Like if text pops up accidentally in the corner of Be Real or something, like
I don't know.
No.
So
I don't know. But yeah. So, but that's like, you can find it anywhere, right? You could find a good poem, whether it's an intentional poem or whether it's something someone crafted as a caption, but it is incredibly poetic and powerful. You can find that anywhere. So I look for text in a lot of places, and the goal is always to get to find the right. I don't think there's like, only one text that could fit any particular commission, but to find one where the conductor and I both feel like this is just going to be really great. We're really enthusiastic, and we're really looking forward to seeing how those words translate into music.
So you start with the text and you make sure it aligns with the vision or the mission of the piece. Then what do you do?
Yeah, then I sit. So you can see. People will probably just be listening to this and not seeing what we're seeing.
They can also watch it, but they
can watch it. But most people will be, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm sitting in my office, and there's on my piano behind me, there's like staff paper and some poetry, and so I try to stay at the piano composing for as long as possible before I move to the computer. When I was younger, I did a lot more composing at the computer, and I don't think every composer has to be a pianist, by the way. Like, I think you could absolutely recreate this process just singing things aloud, or if you play guitar or something else, right? Or like marimba or violin, you can compose on your instrument. But there's something about the acoustics of hearing music exist in real time, in real space, versus like the Sibelius playback. No matter how great those sound samples are, there's just something, again, it's like acoustically, there's something about it ringing in the air that really, like the overtones, I don't know, it just comes together for me in a way where even after I've put everything into, I use Sibelius, but other people use Dorico, Finale. After I've put all the music into Sibelius, I then have to print it out and go back to the piano because I have to work through it in real time, in real space, with real notes. Yeah.
Okay, and so you get your words, you add in all this stuff. Do you get the harmony first or the like? That is the number one question the students asked every guest we had in class this year. Do you hear the harmonic progression first, or do you hear the melody first?
For me, it starts with melody, but I also, like, very commonly I'll be writing a piece and the harmony will sort of overtake the melody. Or if it's an instrumental piece, that's even more true. Like if there aren't words at all, if it's purely non-vocal instruments. So I do, when I have the poem, I sit with it for a long time. And this is part of why I like having that database of like 40 poems, is I know those poems. By the time I pick one, I have read that poem already like 20 something times maybe. So I've already started to internalize the words a little bit. And then I go for the like the natural or a natural-ish version of how those words come out loud. I look for the natural inflections where our voice goes up and down. And whenever I'm talking about this, I use whatever I just said. So inflections, like for some reason I went up there. That wouldn't always be the case, right? If it was at the end of a sentence, I would say inflections, and then it would go down.
Inflections.
Inflections.
Look at us. We're composing as we speak. We're doing great. We're thriving.
Yeah. But there's a rhythm, right? Just not to use the word inflections and like wear it out to death, but inflections, right? Fleck is where the stress is. So that's probably a strong beat. If we're in 4/4, that's probably 1 or 3. If we're in 3/4, that's almost certainly going to be on beat 1, unless it's syncopated. With syncopation, you can get away with almost anything, word stress or syllable stress wise. But in terms of stresses, like there's very few cases in which the word "the" would be on beat 1. Like the word, I'm like of the mindset that should basically never happen unless it's like the whatever. Like, you're describing something and it's like the one. Yeah, there's all of this, like just all of the natural spoken rhythms, melodies inherent in how we talk. All of that can be translated into music. And then I think the harmony comes from sometimes it's just sort of organic and intuitive, but sometimes it's what's being described in the text. Like, what are we trying to text paint? And I like to talk about too how we think about text painting as it applies to melody, like something going up or something down, or like snow falling or something, right? But all of that can be in the rhythm and in the harmony and in the texture as well. So it's a cohesive, yeah. Then the
you
whole
said
piece
some of my
comes
favorite
together.
words. Like the first day of music theory, I just throw out every single solitary vocabulary word I can find. I mean, they get to see them and they have examples and there's games involved. Like, it's not boring. I'm not just like talking, but I throw as many words at them. And then the next class period, we have a game to see how many of the words you can remember. And the number of students that were like, I've only ever associated texture with fabric. And that texture is a musical language. And you think about that when you're composing. It's all connected.
It is all connected. And choral music in particular, like there's so many interesting textures that we can create using like neutral vowels. I like to say ambient vowel sounds. So like vowels that pick up on the words. Like if we say home, O is in that word, right? Like that's if the rest of the choir is singing "oh" and one voice is singing "home," it's going to align perfectly. It gives everyone a chance to really lock into that chord because they're all in the same vowel. So
I love that, ambient vowels. That's a great descriptor.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think there's so many ways. Like that's a texture choice, right? But you could also, I mean, silence is part of texture, like just having one or more voice parts rest while other people do their thing. Like that's right. Using soloists, even if it's briefly, using different rhythms that aren't married to text or are, all of that creates, there's like infinite possibilities for texture. And a lot of composers default to like homophonic, everyone's singing the same words at the same time, or maybe everyone's singing like a background chord and one line has the melody. There's so many more options. I'm talking with my hands a lot because I get excited about this.
I was just about to say, your excitement about texture is so cool because you're speaking it in a way that makes sense. I think some of the biggest feedback, especially in the early weeks of class, is not understanding what texture means. And you're giving not just great definitions, but excellent examples. Texture is choosing silence. Texture is ambient vowels. Texture is choosing soloist. Texture is choices that create a different feel, a different texture.
A different texture.
Fail. That was a teaching fail.
I think there's like, I was just gonna say, I think there's like ways to talk about these things that like counterpoint too, which is a big part of when we talked about texture, like what are the lines doing? Counterpoint is made out to be this really confusing thing, and like don't use parallel fifths or whatever. Like it's just, it can be as simple as like there's two or more lines. Are the two lines doing the same thing? Are they doing the opposite thing? Is one standing still and one's moving, or are they just like kind of doing their own thing completely? Like it can be really simple to explain these concepts that then allow us to make lots of excellent musical choices. But if music theory presents it as like, no, it's a set of rules and you're doing it wrong, then that like the learning doesn't even happen. It just like dies.
Yes. Yeah. I had so at the end of class, so the students pick a semester project or a quarter project that they work on it throughout the whole quarter and present on it at the end. And they have little checkpoints along the way, blah, blah, blah. But it's all different. Some people learn to play an instrument. A lot of people compose. There was some great a cappella arrangements this quarter, actually. I'm super impressed. But I had one student that decided to take everything I ever stated as a rule you have to learn so then you can break it. That was my like quotable moment in class. You have to learn this rule so then you can go break it. And hurry up and go break it, please. And so this one student took everything I ever said in that regard and composed a piece of music with it. So would do the rule and then break the rule right away. The piece is amazing, hard to follow, but it's every single thing that I said was, this is a rule you have to know, but go break it.
And that's amazing. I would love to hear that.
Oh
like,
yeah,
that would be incredible.
I'll get permission, then I'll send it over to you because it's really, really good. I'll email the student. But it's fun to see you applying these things that we learn and know and do. And I wonder, we're all musicians. Are we really taking the time to digest these texture choices as we're teaching them back to our choirs? Are we allowing the choirs to make texture decisions on their own so that, full circle back to the top, the performing ensemble can create a reiteration of it that is 100% them? It's an interesting piece of the collaboration question.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that goes back to also that idea of how, like, where do the singers have agency? If we're talking about a chorus or just any ensemble, like how do we give agency back to the performers? And that I'm just really intrigued by that in general in my own music and in looking at other pieces and seeking out music. Like if there is a conductor involved, how would we let singers make a decision about texture? Or is it about blending? Is it about something more? Is it about encouraging them to go out and try composing or arranging, like, and then bring that piece back to the ensemble so they can hear it in real time and see what works?
That's been the coolest thing. Such good questions. Where do you give them agency? Where do you give choice? There was I forget the person who wrote it. I'll have to look it up. But it's one of those people that you can sign up for their monthly newsletters. I love monthly newsletters, so I know what everyone's doing, not on social media, but in my email inbox. And it was about how each voice has its own role and that you are not a blender. You are your voice. And it was written so well. I would not do it justice, but there were great analogies. And it's so interesting to see that perspective, especially as you're talking about providing everything necessary on the score, but still giving space to create.
Yeah, I love that too. And that idea of not forcing like a certain choral sound or a certain ensemble sound and asking first, like maybe we all want to align our vowels so that like they line up well. But at the same time, asking like what individuals do I have in this group and what do their voices sound like on their own, and how is that going to create an ensemble that's different and distinct from every other ensemble because of the specific people within it? There's a lot there.
There's so much there.
Unpack. Yeah.
Yeah. I always tell my students that the experience we're having singing at this very second, we are the only ones having this experience. And when you perform this piece or the next time you sing it, only those people singing and only those people in that room will experience that piece. Even if it's recorded or videoed, it's not the same, as you said before, acoustical experience. So how are you feeling those things come out of your mouth? And what feeling are you infusing them into them as they come out?
I love that.
What it boils down to, it's how does the music make you feel?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's distinct from other art forms, right? Like in that when it's when it's a recording, we can go back and we can re-listen to something. But the fact that we have to take in music in real time has a real, like, that's my job as a composer, is manipulating time. right? It's manipulating an experience, but also it's welcoming in whatever the audience members, whatever experience they're going to have is not in my control, but my sense, my the way I have them perceive time is somewhat within my control. And that's kind of a crazy superpower to have,
Yes, it is.
right? To be like, I'm going to warp your perception of time. Like if the piece is really awful and boring, you might feel like time is dragging on forever. That is not my goal, but it happens in music sometimes. But I can make it feel like you're suspended in a certain moment, right? Like time has sort of stood still for a moment, or like it's passing really quickly. Like it's really interesting to me to think about all of that. And I don't think I've even scratched the surface of playing with that in my music, but it's whenever I think about it that way, like composers manipulate time, it's a cool way to just think about like, what is music? It's time passing.
Wow. Okay. That might have to be the title. Composers manipulate time. Because that's kind of a big one. We need to sit and think on that one for a second. It's so easy to talk to you. Thank you for doing this.
Likewise.
This is great. Okay, we've talked about how you got to where you are. We've talked about your compositional styles. We've talked about all sorts of cool things related to text and advocacy and collaboration. We've mentioned your book, and I'm going to make sure that link is in the episode notes. Are there any other, you've also mentioned the Project Gutenberg website. I'll make sure to put that in the episode notes too. Are there any other organizations, resources, books that you want to highlight before we end our show questions?
Sure. I mean, if any composers are listening, I love the American Composers Forum. I think it's just composersforum.org is the website for finding resources. And I was really big on entering like competition contests and calls for scores. And that's a whole different conversation. I have a bunch of articles or essays on my website with some of my thoughts on that. But that's a great starting place. Like if you're a composer and you're like, I want to get my music out more, like who could I possibly be sending it to? I love that as a general resource. And in terms of like books on creativity, one of my favorite ones is Bird by Bird by Anne Lamott, which is about writing, but I think it's for everyone. I read it as a teenager and it really stuck with me. And I mention it in Staying Composed because it had such a big effect on just how I view moving through creative blocks, right? She like that's what the whole book is about like what to do when you're feeling overwhelmed in particular. Like how do you she talks about I think a 2-inch picture frame or something. Like if you had to view the world through this little tiny, like your subject, you're writing about something and you can only write about this little tiny view of it. If you start there, then you're not feeling overwhelmed anymore, right? And I think that works for any art. Yeah.
Bird by Bird. Oh, you were such a great resource. Are you ready for the last question?
Yes.
What is the one thing that really matters that you want the listener to walk away from the episode with?
Okay. Out of everything we've talked about, I mean, I feel like I risk sounding like a broken record about like when I talk about staying composed, but really the knowing your own process, just viewing yourself as like you are yourself, right? You are yourself, but you can also make a record. Like it's easier to view your habits if maybe you just write down like, when am I most creative? Like or keep a journal of like, when am I feeling really stuck? At what part of my project like does this happen? Like is it I feel really stuck because I really feel intimidated by the thought of starting a new piece? Like some people get stuck there. Some people get stuck. For me, this is true. Like 2/3 of the way or 3/4 of the way through the piece, there's a moment, and I've written about this too. There's an essay about this on my website as well, but like a moment where I think everything sucks. Like I just think the whole piece is terrible. I just want to throw it out. It happens in every piece I write. And so I finally realized it's part of my creative process. And it's not my job to not feel that way. It's my job to know how to handle feeling that way. So I think that's the most helpful thing we can do for ourselves in creativity and just in our lives, to be like, there are some days where we wake up and we don't feel like doing anything. And maybe that's okay. Like that is okay. Maybe all we need to do is just give ourselves a break and do whatever we need to do to prioritize our mental and physical well-being and put that first. And then if we allow ourselves that, then that opens up space for us to that, like, to heal in whatever ways we need healing, and then go and do whatever it is we want to accomplish.
That's so freeing. Thank you for sharing. I can't wait to read your book. It's in my Amazon cart.
I hope you like it. Let me know what you think.
I know I'm going to like it. I was just wanting to make sure I talked to you first, because I don't want to, if I came in having read the book, I would totally have book clubbed the whole episode, and I would have like, maybe we'll do that another time, because I'm really
That's fun too. But yeah, but it's kind of nice giving like a little teaser, like, here's what you can expect to find. If this resonates with you, maybe you should read the book too.
Well, I'm so excited. Thank you for sharing you and your process and coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much again for having me here. It's been great talking.
All right, what did you learn? I ask that every time. Have you caught on yet? What was your favorite part? What are you taking away from this episode? Is it rewinding and listening to the epic nugget that Dale gave us there at the end to inspire us to be creative and to find our process? Is it the idea of pausing and figuring out how you're giving your seekers agency? Is it the freedom to interpret and experience music? Is it the incredible, mind-blowing idea that Dale said, as a composer, I manipulate time? Whoa. How are you manipulating time right now? What are you listening to? What's in your ears? What are you reading? Follow me on social media. Let me know. Send me a message, emilybirch.org/contact. It's not about me, though. It's about you, because you know what? You matter. We all know that music matters, especially advocating and collaborating and creating and composing and all the things. And I'll see you next time on the Music Ed Matters podcast.